For 20 years, Nathan believed his father had abandoned them. His mother told him he was a selfish man who took their savings and ran. But when Nathan stopped to give a few coins to a man sitting on a park bench, he saw a familiar scar on the man's wrist. The truth was far more dangerous than any lie. The wind howled through the skeletal trees of Central Park, carrying the sharp, unforgiving bite of late autumn. Nathan Cole stood on the paved path, his tailored wool coat barely keeping out the chill that seemed to emanate from his own soul. He watched as joggers and couples in designer athletic wear hurried past a particular bench, their eyes averted, their bodies leaning away as if poverty were a contagious disease. Usually, Nathan was one of them, a man too busy with mergers and acquisitions to notice the nuisances of the city. But tonight, the silence of his penthouse had been too loud, and the ghosts of his past had driven him into the cold. He approached the bench where a man sat slumped, a figure so thin and fragile he looked more like a collection of rags than a human being. Nathan reached into his pocket. He intended to drop $100 bill and walk away, a quick transaction to ease a rare pang of conscience. But as he leaned down, the flickering street lamp caught something that made his entire world tilt on its axis. The beggar's hand was extended, palm up, shaking with a rhythmic tremor. On the wrist, visible beneath a frayed sleeve, was a jagged white scar in the unmistakable shape of a lightning bolt. Nathan's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew that scar. He had been there 20 years ago when a piece of flying metal in his father's workshop had sliced into that very wrist. He remembered the blood, the panic, and his father's calm voice telling him everything would be okay. Nathan's hand froze mid-air. His eyes traveled from the scar to the man's finger. There, nestled against skin darkened by years of street grime, was a tarnished silver band. It was worn thin, but the engraved initials of the Cole family crest were still visible in the dim light. "Dad," Nathan whispered, the word feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. The beggar flinched as if he had been struck. He didn't look up. Instead, he tried to pull his hand back into the shadows of his coat, his body folding in on itself in a practiced gesture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "You have the wrong person, sir," the man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I'm just old Joe, just a nobody." But Nathan wouldn't be deterred. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, ignoring the ruin of his $1,000 trousers. He reached out and gently but firmly took the man's hands. "Look at me," Nathan commanded, his voice thick with a mixture of terror and hope. Slowly, painfully, the man raised his head. When their eyes met, Nathan felt a physical shock. The beggar had eyes the exact shade of emerald green as Nathan's own, a rare trait that had been a point of pride in the Cole family for generations. The man's face went white as a sheet, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the nobody slipped, revealing a depth of agonizing recognition. "Nathan," the man breathed, his lips trembling. The confirmation shattered the last 20 years of Nathan's life into a million jagged pieces. The man his mother had called a coward, the man he had been told died in disgrace after stealing their future, was sitting on a park bench, shivering in the cold. This wasn't a thief who had run away to a life of luxury. This was a man who had been destroyed. "How are you alive?" Nathan choked out, tears finally breaking free and blurring his vision. "Mother said, she told me you were gone. She told me you left us with nothing." The old man's eyes darted around the park, filled with a sudden sharp terror that looked like a survival instinct. He tried to stand, his legs weak and shaking. "You shouldn't have found me, Nathan. You have to go. If she knows, if Patricia finds out you've seen me." He leaned closer, his breath a puff of white in the freezing air. and whispered a warning that chilled Nathan more than the wind. "Your mother, she didn't protect you from me, son. She protected her empire by making sure I stayed a ghost, and she will destroy anyone who tries to bring the truth into the light." The word "dad" hung in the frozen air between them, vibrating with 20 years of unanswered questions, grief, and a sudden, terrifying hope. For Nathan, the world around them, the distant hum of city traffic, the rustle of dry leaves, the judgmental glances of the wealthy elite walking their dogs, simply vanished. There was only this man, this collection of shadows and scars, who carried the face of a legend Nathan had tried to bury. But the reaction he expected, a tearful embrace, a joyous recognition, did not come. Instead, the man flinched as if Nathan had struck him. He jerked his hand back, tucking the silver ring deep into the folds of his filthy coat. His eyes, those emerald green eyes that were a mirror of Nathan's own, darted around the park with a frantic, animalistic terror. "You have the wrong person, sir," the man rasped. His voice was a broken instrument, rough and hollow. "I'm just Joe, old Joe. I don't know who you're talking about. Please, I just want to be left alone." He tried to scramble off the bench, his movements clumsy and weak. His legs seemed to barely support his thin frame, and he nearly tumbled into the dirt. Nathan, acting on instinct, reached out to steady him, his hands gripping the rough fabric of the man's sleeves. Beneath the rags, he felt arms that were nothing but bone and tension. "You're not Joe," Nathan said, his voice rising with a desperate certainty. "I know that scar. I know that ring. And I know the way you're looking at me right now." The man stopped struggling for a second, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He looked down at the ground, and Nathan noticed a small, peculiar movement. The man tilted his head to the left, squinting one eye as he tried to process his fear. It was a habit Nathan saw every morning in his own reflection when he was deep in thought or under pressure. It was a biological signature that no amount of grime or time could erase. "Dad, look at me," Nathan begged, his voice cracking. "It's Nathan. It's your son. Why are you hiding? Why are you living like this? Mother told me you were gone. She told me you took everything and left us in the dirt. But look at you. You didn't take anything. You've been suffering." The man's shoulders began to shake, and for a moment, the old Joe persona seemed to crumble. A single tear tracked through the soot on his cheek, leaving a clean line of raw skin. He looked up at Nathan, and the mask of the beggar fell away, revealing the soul of a man who had been hollowed out by a lifetime of secrets. "Nathan," he whispered, the name sounding like a prayer he hadn't dared to speak in 2 decades. "My little Nathan, you've grown so much. You look just like your grandfather." For a heartbeat, the silence of the park felt sacred. Nathan wanted to pull him into his arms, to take him to the penthouse, to call every doctor in the city and fix whatever was broken. But the moment of connection was shattered by a fresh wave of panic that took hold of Elias. He gripped Nathan's hands, his dirty fingers digging into Nathan's expensive skin. "You have to leave," Elias hissed, his eyes wide with a fear that looked like madness. "You shouldn't have found me. If she knows, if Patricia finds out you've seen me, she'll destroy you, Nathan. She'll take everything you've built. She's not who you think she is. She's a shadow that swallows everything it touches." Nathan felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He thought of his mother, the elegant Patricia Cole, who sat at the head of the boardroom with pearls around her neck, and a smile that never reached her eyes. He had always admired her strength, her ability to survive the betrayal of a weak husband. But looking at his father's shattered state, the narrative he had lived by for 20 years began to dissolve. "I'm a billionaire, Dad," Nathan said firmly, trying to project the power he used to command empires. "I have the best security, the best lawyers. She can't hurt me, and she certainly can't hurt you anymore. Come with me. I have a car right there. I'll take you somewhere safe." Elias shook his head violently, his long gray hair whipping around his face. You don't understand the reach of her hands, son. She didn't just tell you I was dead. She made sure the world believed I was a criminal. She threatened to frame me for things that would have put me in a cage for the rest of my life. She told me if I ever came near you, she'd make sure you met with an accident, just like the one she claimed I died in. The man's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. I stayed away to keep you alive, Nathan. I lived in the gutters so you could live in the clouds. I became a ghost so you could become a king. Please, if you love me at all, walk away and forget you ever saw me. Let me stay dead. Nathan stood there, his knees still in the dirt, looking at the man who had sacrificed his entire existence for a son who had spent 20 years hating him. The truth was far more dangerous than any lie, and as Nathan looked at his father's trembling hands, he realized that the war for his family's soul was only just beginning. He wasn't going to walk away. He was going to bring his father back to life, no matter what it cost him. Nathan insisted on taking his father somewhere warm, but Elias shook his head, his eyes fixed on a path leading toward the industrial outskirts of the city. I have something you need to see, Nathan, he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Nathan signaled his driver, Mr. Peterson, to follow them from a distance in the black sedan, but he stayed on foot, walking beside the man who looked more like a collection of shadows than a human being. They walked past peeling paint and deep potholes until they reached a tiny shack near the river. The roof was made of rusty tin with visible holes, and the door was nothing more than a piece of heavy stained cloth that stirred in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old, dusty memories. Nathan's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand as he looked around the single room. There was no bed, only a thin, frayed mat on a dirt floor and a plastic bucket for water in the corner. It was a space smaller than the walk-in closet in Nathan's luxury penthouse. You've lived here for years? Nathan asked, his voice thick with a pain that no amount of success could soothe. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt on the mat and reached under a loose board, pulling out an old, rusted metal box. Your mother told you I was a thief who stole the family savings, Elias began, his hands shaking as he gripped the box. But the truth is, I discovered she was the one taking the money. She was siphoning funds from our small company to pay for a lifestyle I couldn't yet provide. Nathan felt the floor of his mind shift. He remembered the stories his mother, Patricia, had told him about her struggle to keep them afloat after the betrayal. When I confronted her, she didn't apologize, Elias continued, his green eyes reflecting the dim light of a single flickering bulb. She told me she had already forged my signature on the bank documents. She said if I didn't leave the state and stay dead to the world, she would call the police and have me arrested for embezzlement. Nathan gripped the edge of a wobbly wooden table to steady himself. She would have sent you to prison knowing you were innocent? Worse, Elias whispered, his head dropping in shame. She told me she had enough power and money to make sure I never saw you again. She said a criminal father was a stain on your future, and she would use her connections to make sure you were taken by the state if I tried to fight her. Elias opened the box, revealing a stack of paper that had been yellowed by time. I became a beggar so you could stay a coal. I stayed in the gutters so you could grow up in the clouds. Nathan reached out with trembling fingers and took the stack of papers. They weren't legal documents or money, they were birthday cards. Every single one was addressed to him in his father's careful, slanted handwriting. Happy 11th birthday, Nathan. Happy 15th birthday, Nathan, to my son on his 21st year. None of them had stamps or postmarks. Elias had written them every single year for 2 decades, but he had been too terrified of Patricia's reach to ever mail them. Nathan looked at the cards, then at the man who had eaten scraps and slept on a dirt floor just to protect a son who had spent 20 years hating him, the woman who had tucked Nathan into bed and taught him to be ruthless to maintain their legacy, had built her entire empire on a foundation of lies and the broken spirit of the man she claimed to have survived. She told everyone she was the one who saved the family name, Nathan said, his voice rising with a cold, sharp anger. Elias looked at his son with a sad, knowing expression. She didn't save it, Nathan. She took it, and she made sure the only person who knew the truth was too scared to ever speak again. Nathan stood up, his jaw tight, and his eyes blazing with a new purpose. He reached out and took his father's hand, the one with the silver ring. No more, Dad. No more hiding in the shadows. No more sleeping on the floor. Elias looked toward the cloth door, the old, deep-seated fear returning to his gaze. Nathan, you don't know what she can do. She has power in this city. She has the lawyers and the media. Nathan looked out through the holes in the tin roof at the glowing lights of the city skyline, the skyline his own companies helped build. Let her have the lawyers, Nathan said, his voice quiet and dangerous. I have the truth, and tomorrow night, at her grand anniversary gala, the whole city is going to find out exactly what kind of queen she really is. Elias saw the determination in his son's eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to breathe. Nathan stepped out of the black sedan and stood before the towering iron gates of the coal estate. For the first time in his life, the massive stone pillars and the perfectly manicured lawn didn't feel like a symbol of achievement. They felt like the walls of a prison built on a foundation of bones. The smell of the damp, rotting wood from his father's shack still seemed to cling to his wool coat, a sharp contrast to the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive wax that wafted from the mansion's open foyer. As he walked through the front door, the marble floors echoed with each of his footsteps, sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to a disaster. In the grand living room, he found his mother, Patricia. She was the picture of elegance, draped in a silk gown the color of midnight, her signature pearls glowing against her skin. She was holding a crystal glass, laughing softly with a group of the city's most influential investors. To the world, she was the dignified widow who had raised a titan from the ashes of a broken home. But as Nathan watched her, he saw only the mask, the cold, calculating mask of a woman who had traded her husband's soul for a seat at the head of the table. Nathan waited until the guests had moved to the dining hall before he approached her. Mother, he said, his voice as level as he could manage. Patricia turned, her smile widening, though it never reached her emerald eyes, the eyes she had passed down to him, the same eyes that were currently weeping in a shack by the river. Nathan, darling, you're late for the toast, she said, reaching out to pat his cheek. Nathan flinched, a movement so subtle she almost missed it. Is something wrong? You look like you've been wandering through the gutters. I was thinking about Dad today, Nathan said, watching her face with the intensity of a predator. About the day he left. You always said he was a coward who couldn't handle the pressure of the family name. But tell me, Mother, did you ever truly love him? Or was he just a step on the ladder for you? The air in the room seemed to freeze. Patricia's hand stilled. For one long moment the mask slipped, her lips thinned into a hard white line, and a flicker of something dark and dangerous passed through her gaze. Your father was a mistake, Nathan, she whispered, her voice low and sharp. He was a weak man who would have drowned us both in his sentimentality. I didn't just survive him, I saved you from becoming him. Never ask me that again. She turned and swept out of the room, her silk train hissing against the floor like a snake in the grass. Nathan stood in the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew then that Elias was telling the truth. The woman who had tucked him into bed every night was a stranger he didn't know at all. When the house finally went quiet and the last guest had driven away, Nathan moved with a silent, cold purpose. He knew his mother's habits. Every Sunday night, she spent an hour in her private study, balancing the books. He had always thought she was managing the family's charitable foundations. Now he suspected she was managing a haunting. He used his master key to enter her study. The room smelled of old paper and bitter tea. He walked directly to the mahogany bookshelf, pulling back a fake volume that revealed a small digital safe. He had known the code since he was 16, his own birthday, a date she used as a cruel irony. Inside the safe, he didn't find jewelry or gold. He found a black leather ledger, its pages filled with his mother's precise, slanted handwriting. As he flipped through the entries, his blood turned to ice. For 20 years, there were monthly payments of $10,000 listed under maintenance. He kept turning the pages until he found a folded piece of stationery tucked into the back. It was a contract from a private security firm, the same firm his company used for executive protection. The instructions were written in Patricia's hand. Monitor the subject at the Elm Street district. Ensure no contact is made with the Cole family. If he attempts to enter the city limits, use any means necessary to remind him of the embezzlement files. Nathan gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. She hadn't just driven his father away. She had paid to have him watched like a criminal in his own city. She had spent a fortune to ensure her husband remained a ghost, eating scraps and shivering on a mat while she sat in the clouds. "You knew," Nathan whispered to the empty room, his voice shaking with a rage more dangerous than any lie. "Every single day for 20 years, you knew exactly where he was." He looked at the ledger, then at the single-framed photo on her desk, a photo of Nathan as a child, smiling and innocent. He realized then that his entire life was a performance, and he had been the lead actor in a play written by a monster. He tucked the ledger inside his coat. He had the proof he needed. The paper trail led directly to the woman in the next room. He walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline, the lights sparkling like diamonds. Tomorrow was his mother's grand anniversary gala, a celebration of 20 years of her strength and leadership. The whole city would be there to praise the queen of industry. Nathan leaned his forehead against the cold glass. He wasn't going to give a speech about her success. He was going to give his father his life back, and he was going to make sure the entire city saw the truth behind the mask. The war for the Cole family soul had finally begun. Nathan sat in the back of his sedan, the black leather ledger he had taken from his mother's safe, feeling like a block of ice against his chest. He watched the city lights blur past the window, a shimmering tapestry of wealth and progress that he now realized was woven with threads of cruelty. Every building he had constructed, every deal he had closed, was tainted by the knowledge that his father was living in a shack, while Nathan's mother paid a monthly fee to keep him there. The titan of industry felt like a fraud, a king ruling over a kingdom of smoke and mirrors. He knew the ledger was only the beginning. To truly dismantle the wall Patricia had built, he needed more than just his mother's private notes. He needed the legal trail that had allowed her to bury a living man 20 years ago. He told his driver to head toward the older, quieter part of the city, where the houses were small and the trees were heavy with age. He was going to see Arthur Penhaligon, the man who had been the Cole family's lead counsel for 30 years before his sudden, quiet retirement. Nathan found Arthur's home, a modest brick bungalow that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. When the retired lawyer opened the door, his eyes widened behind thick glasses. He looked at Nathan, then at the black ledger tucked under Nathan's arm. and his shoulders slumped as if a weight he had been carrying for 2 decades had finally become too heavy. "I knew this day would come, Nathan," Arthur whispered, stepping aside to let him in. The living room was filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, every surface covered in legal files and dusty journals. "Your mother is a very thorough woman, but even she couldn't erase everything." Nathan set the ledger on a coffee table. "Tell me about the confession, Arthur. The one you presented to the board 20 years ago. The one that said my father admitted to stealing every cent of the company's capital before he vanished." Arthur's hands shook as he poured 2 cups of tea. He didn't look at Nathan. "I didn't just present it, Nathan. I wrote it." The confession hung in the air like a physical blow. Arthur explained that on the night of the betrayal, Patricia had come to his office with a choice. She showed him records she had forged, that made it look like Arthur himself had been involved in the embezzlement. She offered him $100,000 to correct the narrative, or promised to send him to prison for the rest of his life. "I was a young man with a family, Nathan. I was scared," Arthur said, his voice cracking with a shame that had clearly aged him more than time ever could. He walked to a locked filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a yellowed folder. Inside was a bank statement from the month Elias disappeared. Nathan's eyes fixed on a specific line, a transfer of $100,000 to an offshore account in Arthur's name, followed by a series of smaller, recurring payments to a firm called Shadowcrest Security. "Shadowcrest," Nathan whispered, remembering the name from his mother's ledger. "They weren't bodyguards, Nathan," Arthur said, finally meeting his eyes. "They were wardens. Your mother paid them $10,000 every single month for 20 years, not to protect your father, but to monitor him, to make sure he stayed in the industrial district, to remind him, every time he tried to walk toward the city center, that she had the evidence to put him away for good." Nathan flipped through the folder, finding copies of the original surveillance contracts. They were signed in his mother's precise, cold handwriting. The documents detailed Elias's every move, where he slept, what he ate, the names of the few people who showed him kindness. It was a 20-year record of a man being hunted in his own city. Nathan realized that every time he had sat at Sunday dinner with his mother, every time she had praised his success, she had known exactly which park bench his father was sleeping on. The paper trail was undeniable. It wasn't just a family secret. It was a decades-long conspiracy involving fraud, forgery, and the systematic destruction of a human being. Nathan stood up, his heart burning with a cold, sharp determination. He had the ledger, he had the lawyer's confession, and now he had the paper trail that led directly from his mother's pearls to his father's rags. "Thank you, Arthur," Nathan said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've given me the ammunition I need." "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked, his face pale with worry. Nathan looked at the documents and then out the window toward the glowing skyline where the coal empire stood tall. "My mother is throwing a gala tomorrow night to celebrate 20 years of her leadership," Nathan said. "She wants the whole city to see her as a queen. I'm going to make sure they see her as she really is. I'm going to bring my father home, and I'm going to make sure every single person in that ballroom knows exactly what it cost to build her crown." Nathan sat in the back of his car, his fingers tracing the cold leather of the ledger he had taken from his mother's safe. He thought about the life he had lived for the past 20 years, a life built on the belief that his father had been a coward who abandoned him. He had spent every waking hour trying to be the perfect son, building a billion-dollar empire to make up for the shame he thought his father had brought to the Cole name. But now, after seeing the shivering man on the park bench and reading the lawyer's confession, Nathan realized his entire world was a carefully constructed stage play. The woman he called Mother wasn't a survivor. She was the architect of a man's destruction. He knew he had the evidence to destroy her career and her reputation, but before he pulled the trigger at the anniversary gala, Nathan needed to see one more thing. He needed to know if there was even a shred of the mother he remembered hidden behind her cold, calculating eyes. He decided to use a strategy he often applied to his own employees. He would set a trap to reveal her true heart. Nathan walked into the grand foyer of the Cole mansion. The scent of expensive lilies filled the air, a smell that now made him feel sick to his stomach. He found Patricia in her private library, sitting in a velvet chair, reviewing a guest list for the gala. She looked up, her smile practiced and thin. "Nathan, you look exhausted," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "You need to focus. Tomorrow is the most important night of our lives." Nathan sat across from her, leaning forward with his head in his hands. He made sure his fingers were trembling slightly. "Mother, I have something terrible to tell you," he whispered. Patricia set down her gold pen. "What is it, darling? A business problem?" "It's more than that," Nathan lied, his voice sounding broken. "The federal auditors, they've been investigating the company's offshore transfers from 20 years ago. They found a series of irregularities, forged signatures and secret payments to a security firm called Shadowcrest. They've frozen my personal accounts, Mother, everything. The penthouse, the cars, the investments. They're saying I'm responsible because I'm the CEO. He looked up at her, searching for a flash of concern, a mother's instinct to protect her child. "I need your help," he continued. "If you can transfer your personal inheritance into a trust for me, I can hire the legal team I need to fight this. Otherwise, I could lose everything. I might even face prison." For a long moment, the library was so quiet that Nathan could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Patricia didn't move. She didn't reach out to touch his hand. She didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, her face underwent a terrifying transformation. The mask of the loving mother vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, hard stone. "You're a fool, Nathan," she said, her voice dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. "I spent 20 years making sure that name meant something in this city, and you've let some desk-bound auditors dismantle it in an afternoon?" "I'm your son, Mother," Nathan said, his voice genuinely thick with emotion now, not for the money he pretended to lose, but for the mother he was losing in real time. "Are you saying you won't help me?" Patricia stood up, her silk gown hissing against the floor. "I will not let your incompetence drag me down into the dirt," she snapped. "If you've been careless enough to let them find those old files, then you deserve whatever comes next. I have worked too hard to build this life to lose it because you couldn't keep your house in order." She walked to her desk and picked up her phone, already dialing her lawyers. "I'm calling the board," she said, not even looking at him. "We need to distance the company from you immediately. You should leave, Nathan, and don't come back until you've found a way to fix this mess without touching my money." Nathan stood up slowly. He felt a strange mixture of crushing sadness and liberating clarity. He had seen her real face. She didn't love him. She loved the power he represented. She had treated him exactly like she had treated his father 20 years ago, as an asset to be protected when useful and discarded when it became a liability. "I understand now, Mother," Nathan said, his voice steady and dangerous. "I finally see exactly what kind of queen you are." He turned and walked out of the mansion, leaving her behind in her golden cage. He had the ledger, he had the lawyer's confession, and now he had the final proof that his mother's heart was empty. He drove straight to the hotel where Elias was waiting, his mind fixed on the gala. The whole city was coming to celebrate 20 years of Patricia Cole's leadership, but Nathan was going to make sure that by the time the sun came up, the only thing they would remember was the truth. The black sedan glided away from the cold, imposing gates of the Cole mansion, leaving the Queen of Industry behind in her hollow throne room. Nathan sat in the back, his chest tight with a mixture of grief and a new, sharp clarity. He looked at the man sitting beside him, the man who was supposed to be a memory, a thief, a ghost. Elias sat stiffly against the expensive leather seats, his hands, still stained with the dust of the industrial district, gripping his knees as if he were afraid the car might suddenly vanish. Nathan didn't take his father back to his own penthouse. He knew the penthouse, with its glass walls and cold, modern furniture, would feel like another planet to a man who had lived in a shack for 2 decades. Instead, he directed the driver to the Golden Palace Hotel, the most prestigious establishment in the city center. As they pulled up to the grand entrance, the doorman, in his gold-trimmed uniform, stepped forward to open the door. When Elias stepped out, his oversized, filthy coat and worn shoes stood in stark contrast to the marble pillars and the red carpet. Nathan saw the doorman's expression shift, a quick, involuntary assessment. The man's nose wrinkled slightly, and he looked toward Nathan with a silent question, treating Elias like a nuisance to be managed rather than a guest. Nathan didn't say a word. He simply walked to the front desk and laid his black credit card on the polished surface. "The presidential suite," Nathan commanded, his voice cold and echoing in the high-ceilinged lobby. The clerk's eyes widened as he recognized the name on the card. "Right away, Mr. Cole. Our apologies for the wait." Nathan watched as the staff's attitude transformed instantly from judgment to practiced respect. It made his blood boil, the knowledge that his father was the same man, regardless of the card on the counter, yet the world only saw the rags. They rode the elevator to the top floor in a heavy silence. When the doors opened to the suite, Elias stopped at the threshold. He looked at the 3 bedrooms, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city lights, and the soft white carpets that looked like clouds. "Nathan," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "This is too much. I don't belong in a place like this." "Nothing is too much for you, Dad," Nathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You spent 20 years in the dark so I could live in the light. Now the light is yours, too." Nathan guided his father to the master bathroom and began to run a bath. He added expensive calming oils and ensured the water was perfectly warm. He laid out a soft silk robe and a set of clean clothes he had ordered to be delivered immediately. "Take your time," Nathan said gently. "Wash away every year of that shack. I'll be right outside." Nearly an hour later, the door opened. Elias stepped out, his skin scrubbed clean, his long gray hair damp and combed back. Without the layers of grime and the tattered coat, the resemblance between the 2 men was undeniable. They had the same jawline, the same broad shoulders, and the same emerald green eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "I haven't felt the warmth of a real bath in so long," Elias said, his eyes red from more than just the water. A waiter arrived with room service, roasted chicken, warm bread, and a rich vegetable soup. Nathan watched as his father sat at the table. Elias reached for a piece of bread, but his hands still shook. A rhythmic tremor Nathan now understood wasn't just age, but the result of 2 decades of fear. He ate slowly, his stomach clearly unaccustomed to such a feast. "Tell me about the letters, Dad," Nathan asked softly. Elias looked at the stack of unmailed birthday cards Nathan had brought from the shack. "I wrote them every year, Nathan. On your birthday, I'd sit by the river and imagine what you looked like. I'd imagine you were happy. That was the only thing that kept me breathing. The thought that by staying a ghost, I was keeping you a king." Nathan reached across the table and took his father's hand, feeling the silver ring on the man's finger. "You don't have to be a ghost anymore," Nathan promised. Tomorrow is Mother's anniversary gala. The whole city will be there to celebrate her 20 years of strength. They think they're coming for a party, but they're actually coming for the truth. Nathan looked into the mirror at their shared reflection. The beggar was gone, replaced by a man of quiet dignity. The restoration had begun, but Nathan knew it wouldn't be complete until the world saw the crime that had been committed in the name of the Cole legacy. He looked at his father and said, "Tomorrow, the city will finally know who the real hero of this story is." The grand ballroom of the Cole Plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and clinking crystal. It was the night of the 20th anniversary gala, a monument to Patricia Cole's reign over the city's industrial landscape. The air was thick with the scent of 5,000 imported white lilies, a fragrance that, to Nathan, now smelled like the sterile air of a tomb. Every surface was polished until it shone, reflecting the hundreds of guests who moved through the space like colorful schools of fish, their voices a low, humming drone of vanity and ambition. Patricia was in her element. She stood at the center of the room, draped in a gown of silver sequins that caught the light like armor. Around her neck sat the Cole diamonds, heavy and cold. She was holding court with the mayor and the city's most influential bankers, her laughter sounding like glass breaking, a cold, satisfied sound. To the world, she was the Iron Widow, the dignified woman who had allegedly turned a family tragedy into a billion-dollar legacy through sheer strength and sacrifice. High above the ballroom, in a private gallery hidden from the guests, Nathan stood with his father. The transformation of Elias Cole was nothing short of miraculous. The tattered, filthy coat and the smell of the industrial district were gone, replaced by a custom-tailored charcoal suit and the quiet dignity of a man who had finally been restored. Elias looked down at the woman who had stolen 2 decades of his life. His emerald green eyes, the eyes he had passed to his son, were steady, though filled with a profound, quiet sadness. "She looks exactly the same," Elias whispered, his voice no longer a dry rasp, but a quiet rumble. The same ice in her smile. Nathan gripped the velvet railing. "She won't be smiling for much longer, Dad. She thinks this night is about her glory. She has no idea it's actually about her exposure." He turned to his father, checking the silver ring on Elias's finger. It had been polished until it gleamed like a beacon. "Stay here until I give the signal. I want the world to see you standing tall, not hiding in the shadows." Nathan descended the grand staircase, his heart a steady, cold rhythm in his chest. He moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes from men who had once called his father a disgrace, without ever knowing the truth. He found Patricia near the center of the room, sipping champagne and basking in the flashing lights of the photographers. "Nathan, darling!" she exclaimed, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of the failure he had pretended to be just the day before. She reached out to pat his cheek with a hand that felt like marble. "I see you've managed to dress yourself properly. I hope that auditor nonsense you mentioned was just a bad dream." "It was a nightmare, Mother," Nathan said, his voice flat and professional. "But I think the sun is finally about to come up." Patricia leaned in, her voice dropping to a sharp, dangerous whisper. "Don't embarrass me tonight, Nathan. This is the culmination of 20 years of my hard work. You are the king of industry because I made you one. Remember that when you go up on that stage." "I'll remember everything, Mother," Nathan replied, a cold fire gleaming in his eyes. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, and the room began to quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, the woman of the hour, Mrs. Patricia Cole, and our CEO, Mr. Nathan Cole." The applause was deafening, a wave of sound that filled the massive hall. Patricia stepped onto the stage first, her head held high, soaking in the adulation like a queen on a throne. She took the microphone, giving a short, polished speech about loyalty, perseverance, and the importance of family values. Nathan stood to her side, watching the giant digital screens behind her. They were currently showing a slideshow of the company's greatest achievements: skyscrapers, ribbon cuttings, and carefully staged photos of Nathan and Patricia looking like the perfect, united family. "And now," Patricia said, turning to Nathan with a smile that was as sharp as a razor, "my son will share his vision for the next 20 years. Nathan stepped to the podium. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly at the back of the room, where he could see the silhouette of his father waiting in the wings. The 300 guests, the bankers, the judges, the rivals, all leaned forward, expecting a speech about profit margins and expansion. 20 years ago, Nathan began, his voice thundering over the speakers, I was told a story. I was told that my father was a thief who didn't love me. I was told that my mother was a hero who saved me from the ashes of a broken home. He paused, and the room went oddly, terrifyingly still. Tonight, I'm not going to talk about the future. I'm going to talk about the price of an honest man's life. And I'm going to introduce a guest that my mother has been managing in the shadows for 2 decades. Patricia's smile flickered and died. She reached out to touch Nathan's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "Nathan, what are you doing?" she hissed, her face turning a particular shade of pale. "I'm introducing the truth, Mother," Nathan said, his voice steady and cold. He looked at the technician in the back and gave a sharp nod. The screens behind them went black, and the entire city held its breath. The grand ballroom, once filled with the rhythmic hum of vanity and the clinking of crystal glasses, was suddenly plunged into a terrifying, expectant silence. The digital screens, which had been displaying a curated history of the Cole family's success, flickered to a cold, black void before a new image appeared. It wasn't a skyscraper or a luxury development. It was a grainy video of a tiny, leaking shack in the industrial district, a place that smelled of damp wood and old, dusty memories. The 300 elite guests, the bankers, judges, and politicians who prided themselves on their status, leaned forward, their faces twisted in confusion. On the screen, a pair of shaking hands opened an old, rusted metal box to reveal a stack of unmailed birthday cards, each one a testament to 20 years of suffering and silence. Then, the audio began to play, and the sound quality was so clear it carried to the very back rows of the hall. It was the voice of Patricia Cole, recorded during her private confrontation with Nathan, cold and sharp as a razor. "Your father was a mistake, Nathan," the recording echoed through the speakers. "He was a weak man. I didn't just survive him. I saved you from becoming him." Patricia's face went white as a sheet. Her elegant composure shattering like glass dropped on concrete. She reached out for Nathan's arm, her fingers digging in like claws, her breath coming in ragged hitches. "It's a hoax! This video is a lie!" she screamed at the crowd, but her voice was a thin, broken instrument that no longer commanded authority. The guests remained frozen, their phones raised not to capture beauty, but to document a disaster. Nathan stood at the podium, his emerald green eyes, the exact shade of the nobody his mother had tried to bury, fixed on the back of the room. He gave a sharp nod to the technician, and the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a thud that seemed to vibrate in the guests' bones. A man stepped into the light, and the room went icy cold. He wasn't the shivering beggar from the park bench. He was a man restored, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost $5,000, his long gray hair combed back with quiet dignity. As he walked down the center aisle, his steps were steady, though he still carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be invisible for too long. The gasps from the audience moved through the hall like a wave of shock rolling through tall grass. Men who had worked with Elias Cole 20 years ago stood up, their mouths falling open in disbelieving horror as they recognized the dead founder of the city's largest firm. The old Joe persona was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a photograph from 2 decades ago, healthy and standing tall. Elias reached the stage and stood beside his son, his emerald green eyes meeting Patricia's gaze for the first time in 7,300 days. The silver ring on his finger, polished until it gleamed like a beacon, caught the light of the chandeliers. "I'm alive, Patricia," Elias said, his voice no longer a dry rasp, but a quiet, powerful rumble that filled the silent hall. "I stayed in the gutters so our son could live in the clouds, but the light has finally found me." The truth landed on the audience like a physical weight, and the warmth that had been there for Patricia during the gala shifted into something cooler and more careful. People were not cruel. They did not shout, but the withdrawal of their respect was total and devastating. Patricia looked around at the faces of the people she had spent 20 years trying to impress, and she saw them letting go. She was a queen without a throne, standing in a silver gown that now looked like armor for a war she had already lost. Nathan stepped back to the microphone, his voice thundering over the crowd. "For 20 years, this city was told a story of strength and sacrifice," he said, looking at the 300 stunned witnesses. "Tonight you have seen the real hero, the man who sacrificed everything for love, while the woman beside me sacrificed everyone for power." As Elias stood tall, a single woman in the 4th row began to clap, a slow and serious sound that was soon joined by others until the whole ballroom was filled with a thunderous, emotional applause. It wasn't the celebratory applause of a party, but a tribute to a man who had finally walked through the gate. Patricia slumped back into her chair, a mask of stone on a woman who realized that no amount of money could ever bury the truth again. The applause that had thundered through the grand ballroom of the Cole Plaza slowly died down, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. Patricia Cole sat frozen in her silver-sequined gown, the diamonds around her neck catching the light like a heavy shackle rather than a trophy. Her face, which had been the picture of elegant, unshakable strength for 2 decades, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as she stared at the husband she had tried to erase from existence. Elias stood beside Nathan on the stage, his back straight and his emerald green eyes, the same eyes Patricia had looked into every day through her son, now burning with a quiet, steady fire. The 300 guests, the city's most powerful bankers and politicians, stood as silent witnesses to a crime that no amount of money could ever bury again. The silence was shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the ballroom's side doors opening. 4 men in dark professional suits entered the room, their faces as cold and unyielding as the evidence Nathan now held in his hands. They were federal officers, and they didn't look at the expensive flower arrangements or the crystal chandeliers. They looked only at the woman sitting at the head of the table. Nathan stepped forward, picking up the black leather ledger he had recovered from his mother's private safe, and he laid it on the podium for everyone to see. "For 20 years, this ledger has been the secret map of a man's destruction," Nathan said, his voice thundering through the hall over the speakers. He flipped to the pages detailing the recurring monthly payments to Shadow Crest Security, payments made to keep his father imprisoned in an industrial shack while Patricia lived in a mansion. He then produced the signed confession from Arthur Penhaligon, the family's former lead counsel, who admitted to forging the documents that had framed Elias for embezzlement 2 decades ago. The gasps from the audience moved through the hall like a wave of shock, no longer confused, but filled with the sharp, cold edge of total realization. Patricia finally found her voice, but it was no longer the smooth, silk-wrapped instrument of a queen. It was a shrill, desperate sound that echoed off the marble floors. "This is a setup! Nathan, you are being manipulated by this beggar," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "He was a weak man who abandoned us. He's just a street rat looking for a payday." But even as she shouted, the guests began to move. They didn't shout back, and they didn't argue. They simply turned their backs on her, row after row. The withdrawal of their respect was a total and silent wave that left Patricia standing alone in the center of her own celebration. The lead officer reached the stage and pulled out a pair of cold steel handcuffs. "Patricia Cole, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the systematic obstruction of justice," the officer announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. As the metal clicked around her wrists, the diamonds on her neck caught the light one last time, a glittering reminder of the status she had traded her husband's life to keep. "I did it for you, Nathan!" Patricia cried out as she was led away, her composure finally crumbling into ugly, jagged sobs. "I did everything to make you a king. Your father would have ruined our future." But Nathan didn't answer her. He watched as the woman who had raised him, the woman who had tucked him in while knowing his father was shivering on a dirt floor, was escorted out of the building she had used as her throne. The cameras of the reporters she had invited to celebrate her success were now flashing to document her total and absolute disgrace. Ilias stood in the center of the stage, the silver ring on his finger glowing like a beacon in the afternoon light. He looked at the room full of people who had once called him a disgrace, and saw only a group of strangers who no longer had any power over him. He turned to Nathan and placed a rough, calloused hand on his son's shoulder, a hand that had been scrubbed clean at the Golden Palace Hotel, but still carried the strength of 20 years of survival. "The kingdom she built for you was made of smoke and lies, Nathan," Elias whispered, his voice steady and full of a dignity that no amount of money could buy. "It's time we build something that actually has a heart." Nathan looked at his father, then at the empty chair where his mother had sat, and he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that had been there since he was 10 years old. He didn't look at the photographers or the bankers. He simply took his father's hand and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the Iron Widow and her destroyed legacy behind in the dust. 6 months had passed since the night the lights went out on Patricia Cole's empire, and the city was still whispering about the Gala of Truth. The headlines had dominated every newspaper and news site for weeks, describing how the youngest billionaire in the state had exposed his own mother to restore the father the world thought was a ghost. But for Nathan Cole, the noise of the city and the flashing cameras of the paparazzi had become background static. He was no longer interested in being the titan of industry who ruled from a cold glass penthouse that touched the clouds. Nathan stood on the wide wooden porch of a new house, one he had built not for status, but for peace. It was situated on the edge of the very industrial district where his father had once shivered in a tin shack. Instead of the luxury high-rises Patricia had planned to build by destroying the homes of the poor, the land now held the Elias Cole Hope Center. It was a place with bright rooms, warm beds, and a kitchen that never ran out of food, a sanctuary for those the city had tried to make invisible. Beside him sat Elias, resting in a comfortable chair as the morning sun began to warm the air. The transformation that had begun at the Golden Palace Hotel was now complete. His hair was neatly trimmed, and the old Joe persona had vanished, replaced by the quiet, steady dignity of a man who knew he was finally home. The severe malnutrition and the hollow look in his cheeks that the doctors had warned about were gone, replaced by a healthy glow and a strength Nathan hadn't seen since he was 10 years old. Hello, friends. We have reached the final chapter of Nathan and Elias's journey. If you believe that a family built on truth is stronger than one built on gold, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And tell us in the comments, what was the most important lesson you learned from this story? We love hearing from our community. You're thinking about the office again, aren't you? Elias asked, his voice now a warm rumble instead of a dry rasp. He looked at his son with those emerald green eyes that Nathan now saw every morning in his own reflection with pride instead of pain. Nathan smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, something he had rarely done in the 20 years he spent under Patricia's thumb. Actually, Dad, I was thinking about the board meeting yesterday. They wanted to know when I was coming back to the headquarters full-time. I told them I already have a headquarters right here. Nathan had stepped down as the active CEO of the main firm, choosing instead to run the family's new charitable foundation alongside his father. He spent his mornings not in meetings about profit margins, but on the construction site of the center's new vocational school, where he worked side by side with the builders. He had learned that character is not something you buy with a paycheck. It is something you build with your own 2 hands. He reached out and took his father's hand, feeling the silver ring on Elias's finger. It was no longer tarnished or hidden in the shadows of rags. It had been polished until it gleamed like a beacon in the sunlight. It was a symbol that the Cole legacy had finally been cleansed of the lies that had nearly destroyed it. I missed so much, Nathan, Elias said softly, his gaze drifting to the children playing in the park across the street. 9 years, no, 20 years of your life that I can never give back to you. You gave me something better, Dad, Nathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. You gave me the truth. You stayed in the gutters so I could live in the clouds, and even though that was a choice you shouldn't have had to make, I understand now that you did it out of a love that Mother could never understand. Patricia was currently serving a long sentence in a federal facility, her diamonds and silk gowns replaced by a uniform that held no status. She had tried to fight the case, but the paper trail of her recurring payments to Shadowcrest Security and the signed confession from the family lawyer were ironclad. Nathan had visited her once, not out of hate, but to tell her that he had finally found the partner he was searching for, his father. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Nathan looked out at the community they were rebuilding. He thought about all the people who had walked past Elias on that park bench, never realizing they were looking at a king in disguise. He made a silent promise to himself that he would never be one of those people again. From now on, he would look at every face, listen to every story, and remember that the most valuable things in life are often the ones the world tries to throw away. Are you hungry? Nathan asked, standing up and offering a hand to his father. I think it's time for breakfast, and this time I'm making the eggs. Elias laughed, a sound that was no longer rusty from lack of use. As long as they're better than the ones your mother used to make me, he joked, leaning on his son as they walked into the warm, bright house. The billionaire who had once been cold and efficient had finally learned that real success isn't measured by the height of a building, but by the depth of the love you have for the people who stayed by your side when you had nothing. The truth had arrived late, but it had arrived with enough light to chase away 20 years of shadows. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it for you. If Nathan's journey touched your heart, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the truth, even when it hurts, is always better than a comfortable lie. Have you ever found the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it was hard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you in my next story.